said Tenebrous, and his calm, oily voice cut through the madness and stilled it with shocking suddenness. He reached out one pale hand and plucked the treasure from Kargathar's smouldering gauntlet. "The Ring of Bukharis," he crooned. His treasure glinted, a signet ring as black as marble set with a blood-red stone. "Now," he said in exultation, "now they will know our vengeance." Tenebrous slipped the ring onto a finger. He admired it a moment, then said to Yang, "Well done, well done. Kargathar was right not to let me eat you." He wagged a finger at her, as if this were amusing. "We have everything we need to end this foolish crusade of the corpse god's son, yes?" "Magos Xyrex's weapon is ready then," said Kargathar. Nearly, chuckled Tenebrous. He peered at Yang. "You are a native of this world, yes?" "Yes, my lord." "Tell me then, what do you know of the apostate Cardinal Bukharis?" "Little, my lord," said Yang. "I only know that he is important to the gods' plans, that he was a famous figure in the past, which is why I humbly set myself to seeking out his tomb." "Ah, so you know nothing." "To be expected, because that is what they intended," said Tenebrous. "The suppression of true knowledge, you see?" he said to Kargathar, smiling again. "Ever the corpse god's modus operandi." He walked around Yang, looking her up and down hungrily. "Bukharis, young lady, was a cardinal of this world, its ruler some 4,000 years ago. You will not find his name on the cardinal's column, nor will you find it in any but the most secret of histories. Tell me," he said, "you must surely know who built this delightful building?" Yang looked to Kargathar in confusion. The dark apostle inclined his head. "My lord knows that this building was the project of the Cardinal Asclepius," said Yang, unsurely. No, Tenebrous said, raising an admonitory talon. "That is what they tell you. No, this cathedral was built by Bukharis. It was the cause of his rise to power." His too wide smile grew wider still. "And the cause of his downfall. Despite its importance as a cardinal seat, Gathalamor was once a very poor world. Though it has always possessed a favorable sighting on the currents of the Soul Sea, it was largely overlooked in favor of other, more developed places. Cardinal Bukharis decided to change that by attracting the attention of his selfish god. So he constructed this temple, the largest cathedral for hundreds of light years in any direction. Sadly, for the people he ruled, he needed labor, and he needed money. They gave their lives in providing both. He worked a remarkable number of laborers to death to ensure its completion. He was quite the orator, and they died for their god willingly. Those that wouldn't were burned or fled. I believe that the catacomb gangs, the ones the locals call bone whittlers, your people, yes? They originated from that trying time." Tenebrous lifted his hands and spread them. But still the cathedral was not finished. His plans grew more grandiose. He needed more materials, more bodies, and more coin. When he could gather no more from the neighboring worlds by diplomatic means, he merely took them by force. Then he took more and more, until before the rotten bureaucracies of Terra had noticed, he had carved himself out an empire. What an empire it was, little acolyte! The faith of the corpse worshippers harnessed and turned against their god for the benefit of one man, Cardinal Bukharis. He waved a hand, and scenes of battle appeared, wavering on the air. Imperial soldiers killing each other, both under banners of faith, their faces twisted in hatred. It could not last, of course. Terra is slow to react, but it reacts. Bukharis was caught and slain, and Asclepius succeeded him. He was a man as vain as he was fearful, and corpulent, Tenebrous said with a short bark of laughter. In fact, the cardinal rather resembled this building. What could he do? Asclepius couldn't destroy this place, for it was a monument to the emperor. But it could not be left in the name of Bucharest the Apostate. Oh no, so it was altered and reconsecrated. Asclepius's name was attached to it. More men and women died to remake it. More worlds were beggared, though not Cathalamor, and this time at the Imperium's behest. As Bucharest originally intended, the pilgrims did come, and by their billions. They enriched this place. He gave a half-feline growl. Foundations laid upon a strata of exploited workers, watered with blood and seeded with bitterness, said Tenebris, savouring the notion. It is perfect, is it not, little acolyte? Perfect. Always the corpse worshippers erect their own gallows and willingly jump, and the pantheons smile to see them dance upon the rope. Delicious. You see, Bucharest had nothing but a desire to exalt his god, yet by trying he favoured ours. He paused. And tell me, do you know what became of Bucharest after he died? No, my lord, said Yang. She did not enjoy Tenebris's attention. She tried to hide her fear, but Kargatha could see from the movement of her chains that she was trembling. Asclepius was chosen for his level head, yet the new cardinal became obsessed with the idea that the spirit of Bucharest haunted this world. He feared his diocese would be tainted by Bucharest's incorporeal presence. He was advised to shoot Bucharest's mauled remains into the sun, but he feared that would set the apostate spirit free. Perhaps he was right, for Bucharest was a willful man in life. Instead, Asclepius chose to bury Bucharest and the Cathalamorian ring of office far underground. This ring. He held up the jewel. Asclepius refused to wear it, you see. You have seen the decoy tombs, the ancient constructs left to prowl the deeps, the warding spells put about Bucharest's resting place. Yang nodded. She had seen all those things. Yes, my lord. All that was the work of Asclepius. By the time he died, he was mad with paranoia, but it's thanks to him we have this weapon. Tenebris held his curled fist up and greedily looked at his prize. In response, the ruby on the ring flashed with hidden fire. How is it a weapon, my lord? Yang asked. Both Kargatha and Tenebris looked at her. The little acolyte speaks without prompting. Bold, bold. Tenebris crept forward, reached out his spidery fingers, and gripped Yang's face. She flinched, but did not move as he turned her head about, examining her. A thin tongue flicked over his lips as he tasted her scent. How is it a weapon, little acolyte? The answer is, it is not, he sniggered. Bucharest's spirit still clings to this jewel, but what is that? One man's soul. Nothing. The ring really is little more than a gewgaw, in one respect. He let Yang go. But in another respect, it is a symbol, and symbols are important when harnessing the energies of the warp. It is a symbol of how one man followed his faith as far as one can go, and faith, no matter the kind, always leads to the warp. It is a symbol of how belief in a false god can be turned to the service of the true gods. Sorcery, young lady, needs symbols, and this is one of the greatest you will find. Tenebris waved his hands about airily. Human beings are crude and weak, but it is within our power to remake ourselves into something greater. That is the power the Emperor denies his grovelling subjects. He keeps the power of the warp to himself, for he is a jealous god. His eyes glittered more intensely. The Emperor would have all humanity be slaves, to deny us choice as he crawls closer towards his apotheosis. He wants men to be like servitors, yes, or orcs. One sees it in the orc, this singular purpose. But we are not orcs, are we? We can rise above the limits others place upon us. We who follow the Four are truly blessed, for we have seen the light." He smirked again. Needle teeth flashed in his cowl. "This is a symbol I will build our weapon around." He raised his hand high over his head, so that the ring caught a stray shaft of daylight. His sleeve fell back to reveal a skinny arm covered in tumors. "A weapon that could slay a god!" he shouted. His words reverberated around the dome. The shades were sent into a rustling frenzy. Tenebrous' power blasted through Kargathar, overwhelming his own. The pillar of darkness vanished, and his helm crashed to the floor. Yang was flung back. A gale rose out of nowhere, and Tenebrous' laughter filled the world. Kargathar's cloak of shadow streamed away to nothing, and he was forced to set himself into the psychic storm and harness his own power, so meagre and impotent, to keep to his feet. The wind stopped. Tenebrous lowered his arm and pulled down his sleeve, covering his disfigurements, his hand and the ring. His shade settled into rustling disquiet. "Do you know, Apostle," he said, his voice quiet and genial again, "I believe I will take you up on that meal after all. Have them send someone up on your way out. Yes?" "Of course, Lord Tenebrous," said Kargathar. He stood up. His cloak returned, shyly at first, like a frightened animal. His throat was dry, his mind numb. All around him the shades rattled. It was getting dangerous. Tenebrous was fickle and might slay them on a whim. He retrieved his helm, took Yang by the arm, and dragged her away. "And Apostle," Tenebrous called after him as he reached the doors. "Make it someone hearty, yes? I find myself famished." The doors clanged shut behind them. Kargathar hauled Yang to her feet. "No more will his power cow me," he said to his acolyte. "Gather your sorcerers, my faithful witch. I have business with the gods." Chapter 17. Arrival at Gathalamor. Ebel Sanger. Radiance. "Navigator Teshwan has sent the first signal. Prepare for translation." Hard and resonant as blade striking blade, Shipmistress Ebel Sanger's voice carried over the noise of the command deck. Akalor watched her from his observation platform. The shipmistress was impressive, so much confidence and purpose contained in her frail mortal body. In appearance, she was short and heavily built. Her face had the permanent scowl of a Terran-bred aristocrat, a look intensified by the augmetic that replaced her right eye. Around her throat was a vox unit in the shape of a golden torque. She was both the terror and beloved talisman of her crew. Akalor, too, had an amount of affection for her. Her command throne swept over the deck in its gyrosphere cradle. "Dim lumens, get our fields to full. Begin translation hymns," the shipmistress commanded. Golden light turned red. A choir began to sing. Klaxons blared a harsh tune to compete with them. "Check locks on ocular shuttering. Power off non-essential mechanisms. Brace all sections. Void shield control. Prepare for emergency activation. Stealth control. Ready obfuscation fields. Standby enginearium for reactor output increase and real space drive ignition." The commands were always the same, drawn from ancient naval checklists. Akalor knew them well. He and the Radiants had a long association, but though the commands had changed little in the centuries he had used the vessel, they had changed subtlety by subtlety. "And so what was becomes what will be," he thought. "Not even the Imperium can arrest change completely." The ship rode over some roughness in the warp, and Akalor's companion gasped. Mistress of Astropath's Ashmaeln was easy to miss, being slight beside his armoured bulk, and he himself had almost forgotten she was there. "Be ready," she said. Where Akalor stood easily, riding every jump of the ship with a mariner's ease, she gripped the railing of the platform with white-knuckled hands. "This will not be a pleasant experience." She was saying it for her own benefit rather than his. He pitied her. Transition to and from the warp was painful for psychers, especially in the benighted times. "You should take your seat, Mistress Astropath," Akalor said. "Not likely," she replied grimly. She hunched further over the railing. "I feel safer next to you, Shield Captain." Ashmaeln was young. Though she was blind, like most of her kind, she wore a sight visor wired into her temples, so she saw well enough. The augmetic was broad and mirror-faced, almost big enough to cover the pink spiderwebs of scarring around her eye sockets. She was healthier looking than most astropaths, something that spoke to a certain indomitability of spirit, for all but the hardiest souls were eroded by exposure to the warp, and she was powerful enough to warrant an Eta grading on the Imperial assignment scale. Even a little higher, and Ashmaeln would have found herself serving the Emperor in a different capacity. It was rare to encounter an astropath of such potency. Unfortunately, Akalor had discovered Ashmaeln's talent came with a tendency to speak her mind. "Stay close, then, and try to keep to your feet," he said.
"Easy for you to say," she responded sharply. "You are 10 feet tall and have magnetic boots."
The ship listed hard to port. Ashmaeln stumbled to the side and stifled a cry. Akalor didn't activate his maglocks. He didn't need to. No amount of turbulence would upset his balance, but he did not comment. Unlike Ashmaeln, he felt no need to have the last word. He instead watched the crew, finding their collective efforts fascinating. He had never lost his interest in humanity, and that had recommended him for service in the emissary's Imperator's shield host. He felt at one with humans, but apart from them, a feeling that gave him cause for sadness on occasion. The Radiance was of cruiser mass, though being an Adeptus Custodes vessel, no standard class designation could be applied to it. The bridge was a comparatively small, hollow sphere, busy with walkways and platforms. Its instruments were fashioned from burnished brass and a wood so hard that Akalor had originally taken it for stone. 100 deck officers and tech magi worked at its consoles. Armsmen stood sentry at the back. All the ship's crew, Imperial and Mechanicus alike, wore black and bronze armor and robes in place of the typical naval attire, and they looked impressive for it. It was noisy. Commands competed with the clatter of bone ordinator keys, the whir of cogitators, the howling of klaxons, and the choir of priests. Clades of servitors mumbling their way through repetitive tasks filled out the racket. Another roil of turbulence shook the vessel. Ashmaeln gave out an involuntary moan. The crew began strapping themselves into seats and restraint alcoves. "Maybe you should sit," said Akalor.
"I said no," she snapped. "Increase warp engine output. Begin translation,"
Sangar commanded, and the activity on the bridge intensified. Hazard lumens strobed, transforming familiar bulkheads into shadowed layers for unclean things. Akalor shifted as he felt spiritual resonance build, thickening the air with false pressure. Translation was the most perilous time aboard a ship. It was the moment at which the door between materium and immaterium was forced widest. It was when the ship's Geller fields were most stressed. It was the time that the malefic might creep in. Akalor's hand twitched, thinking of his sword, Prosectis, maglocked to his back. Anything daring to manifest aboard a custodian vessel would suffer for its foolishness. The warp engines screamed. Gossamer touches trailed across Akalor's skin beneath the auramite of his armor. There were many deed names engraved across the inner surfaces of the plates. He loathed the idea of some unclean entity touching them, tasting and knowing them, but the thought never surfaced on his face. A searing heat washed over him, followed by intense cold. The human crew cried out, and many of them shouted prayers, but Marcus Akalor was Adeptus Custodes, the product of potent alchemy. He was one of the 10,000, being fashioned by the Emperor to stand at his side. The unholy touch of the warp found little purchase upon such a one as he, and he stood impassive as a rock in a storm, while the mortals on the bridge suffered. A woman manning an augury station slumped forward, blood streaming from her eyes. A member of the helm section unstrapped himself from his restraints and ran full tilt into an iron pillar, knocking himself out. The ship yawed violently. Only exceptional individuals could serve the Adeptus Custodes, and yet the violence of the warp in that new era taxed even them, and Akalor was witness to a scene of controlled pandemonium. The ship's motions became more extreme. "Warp engines prime for Empyrean egress," a crewman shouted. Akalor felt his armored weight lighten as the Radiance went into a dive, and the grav plating labored to compensate. Shudders raced through the decking. A pipe burst near the back of the bridge, sending out a plume of gas. "We will not survive much more of this ship, mistress," the Master of Integrity shouted. They were all shouting, for a fearsome roar had built. The shaking increased, blurring Akalor's sight, doubling images, quadrupling them. Then again, until every person trailed a rainbow smear behind them, and the ship's architecture was a confused mess of vibrating colour.
Await my command!
The shipmistress's eyes were fixed on a run of glass spheres set into her throne arm, the navigatorial signal lumens. All but one now shone red. The last remained dark. Something hit the ship hard in the side, and it slewed around. Alarms blared at the Geller control platform. One of the consoles exploded, showering the officer manning it with hot sparks that made her scream. A servitor moved from its alcove to attend to the damage, but the next jolt of the ship saw it flung across the deck into a cogitator bank. Ashmaeln shrieked, and Akalor put a protective arm around her.
Shipmistress, the Master of Integrity relayed. Geller field down to 63%. Integrity fields failing on decks 14 through 17. We have to translate now.
Wait, Sangar commanded. The turbulence increased with every moment. Akalor rode out each new roll. Ashmaeln hugged into his side.
I can feel them, she whimpered. I can feel them trying to get inside.
The final bulb on the arm of Sangar's throne shone out red with a soft plink that Akalor's enhanced hearing caught even through the tumult.
Now, Sangar screamed. Warp engines to maximum. Geller command, pierce the veil. All hands prepare for immediate translation.
Wailing trumpets blared from every quarter, and the unbearable caresses wormed their way instantly across Akalor's flesh. There was a flash of bright light, and the noise abruptly ceased. The unnatural sensations faded with the swiftness of a dream forgotten. The turbulence was done. A numb silence prevailed.
Translation successful. All stations report in, said Sangar.
One by one, the various divisions of the ship's officers gave their reports.
Thrown alive,
said Ashmaeln. She wriggled out of Akalor's grip, turned, bent over, and vomited copiously upon the floor. She was not the only one. Are you all right, Mistress Astropath? Akalor said. Ashmaeln wiped her mouth on the back of a shaking hand.
Of course, I'm not... thrown...
She vomited again. At last, the klaxons ceased their wailing, and the lumens returned to their usual golden glow. A soft chime issued from Akalor's vox, followed by the gruff voice of Hastius Vikalan.
What did I miss, Marcus?
The usual performance.
I felt it. A bad translation. The seers were right. There is something amiss in this system. What does the Astropath say?
Akalor looked down at Ashmaeln. She was bent double, back heaving, as she struggled to keep her stomach climbing out of her mouth. Nothing. She is inconvenienced at this time. There was a soft rumble as the real space engines ignited. What of the Primaris Marines? Akalor asked. Vikalan grunted.
I've not seen anything to worry me. They're Adeptus Astartes through and through. They barely stopped drilling for the translation. They're off to start again now.
Nothing unusual?
Nothing.
There was a hollow boom from somewhere above.
You hear that?
Asked Vikalan. Physical impact, said Akalor.
I'm coming up to you, said Vikalan. The Space Marines can look after themselves for a while.
Shipmistress Sangar, what is the nature of the strike we experienced? Akalor asked.
Debris, my lord,
Sangar called down from her throne orb, where she was poring over her instruments. The throne cradle shifted on its gimbal, swinging across the bridge to be closer to the augury consoles.
A field of some size. Determining now.
A hololith came on, displaying near space as a graphical data display, alive with swarms of red dots. Those pieces of debris nearest were rapidly scanned, and accurate volumetric light sculptures popped into being, appended with tags of data, until a real-view holo was established, showing the radiance in a cloud of metal.
Battle's aftermath, said Akalor. Someone was fighting here. A large engagement.
Indeed, my lord,
Sangar said. Further impacts rattled off the vessel, all minor, but according to the displays, there were large elements moving erratically close to their position.
Get the void shields up, please, Megos Zarch. Nobody will spot us among this, unless they are on top of us. And get me the oculus open. I've had enough of sailing blind.
Instruments sang. The shutters across the grand window at the front of the deck clanked back, revealing a voidscape thick with spinning metal chunks. The command deck was mounted far back on the spine of the superstructure, and Akalor could see particular debris hitting the ship's narrow length forward. Space flexed, The voids initiated. Sparks lit upon the energy skin as the debris was shunted into the warp, and the rain was largely stymied.
Mr. Osmore, have you determined the extent of this debris field? Sangar asked.
Auspexes indicate a 40,000-mile dispersal, my lady. A compact but fierce fight, then, said Akalor.
Helm Adepts, report, Sangar commanded. Wreckage dense and mobile, my lady, but the radiance is agile. We'll be out of this in minutes. The Emperor's my witness. Thank you, Miss Feng. Carry on. Migos Zach, how are my shields? Fully roused and formidable, Shipmistress Sangar. The obfuscation engines are ready. We may invert voids and engage shrouding at your command. Advisory, the rituals of awakening were completed only 7.9 seconds previous. Resultant, impact damage to hull sections Quartus, Sextus, Septimus. Extent of damage currently unknown. Understood, Migos Zach. Report to me the moment you have initial damage reports. Confirmatory, Shipmistress Sangar.
A choral chime accompanied the opening of the bridge blast doors, and Hastius Vikalan entered. Vikalan was huge, even for a custodian, and wore his bulky plate as comfortably as a lesser man would a robe. He wore his hair tied back in a neat queue. It was as white as snow, and had been since his earliest days, as was his close-cropped beard. Eyes of a piercing blue looked out from beneath an aquila, marking his forehead.
"Marcus,"
said Vikalan, as he joined Akalor.
"Hastius,"
said Akalor. Vikalan looked down at Ashmael and grinned.
"Mistress Astropath," he said.
Custodian,
said Ashmael weakly. She took Vikalan's arrival as the cue to rally herself, and got up.
"This was not a small fight,"
said Vikalan, running expert eyes over the hololithic displays and the view outside.
"Indeed,"
said Akalor. Debris winked in the sun as far as they could see.
Miss Chokvel, Sangar was asking, do you have anything for me on the nature of the wreckage? Picked analysis suggests...
A klaxon blared, sudden and loud, overriding the buzz of conversation. An instant later, the void shields blazed, and the radiance shook. On nearby gel screens, Akalor saw grainy shapes, tumbling huge and ragged through the void. The radiance had ploughed into one of these and shouldered it aside.
Helm Adepts, what in throne's name was that? Barked Shipmistress Sangar. How did you miss something that big? Apologies, Shipmistress. It was the lesser of two evils, came the shaken voice of Helm Officer Feng. A larger fragment is bearing in from the forward arc, 300 degrees vertical, shielded by flex swarms, moving slow enough to avoid displacement response from the voids. Evasive action was required.
Debris field exit reduced by 4.4 minutes, my lady, added her fellow officer, Okasva.
Very good, replied Sangar. But if you put any more dents in my radiance, I'll have you both out there in hard suits, smoothing them out by hand. Clear? As Corfian crystal, my lady, replied Feng. Miss Chokvel, in your own time, prompted Sangar.
The Adept Analyticus continued her report as though nothing had occurred.
Initial auguries suggest that a number of ships were destroyed during whatever conflict took place here. There is also a residual warp trace. Several ships entered the Empyrean here.
She listed a number of vessels whose warp engine signatures possibly matched.
And their enemies?
Sangar asked.
Hereticus Diabolus Extremis, my lady, replied Chokvel.
Manderville battle, said Akalor to Vikalan, as Chokvel delivered her report. The ships falling back to Necromunda took to the point, with the non-warp system ships to cover their retreat. Brave. How many got out? That is a question Lord Gilliman would want to know.
It does not seem long ago, said Vikalan.
Holding action, maybe. Or perhaps they delayed to perform hit-and-run actions, wearing the enemy down for a few weeks before they were finally forced to flee, said Akalor. Or it could be the rift. Time is all ravelled. They could have fled the moment the enemy arrived, and we translated only days later, according to local time.
Then we need to get an idea of when we are, said Vikalan.
I concur. Shipmistress Sangar, Vikalan said, please provide us with a chronological estimate. A date was given. Vikalan frowned. 20 days after our departure. We're cutting this close. We were in the warp longer than anticipated, said Akalor. Fleet Primus will soon be here. Sangar's throne turned around and moved on its mechanical arm towards the custodians until she was level with the observation gallery. Many of the Emperor's servants were entirely undone by the presence of a custodian, their senses oppressed by their aura of power. But Ebel Sangar had spent most of her adult life serving the Emissaries Imperator's shield host, and she didn't avert her gaze. "As you appreciate, my lords, sailing the Empyrean at this time is an imprecise endeavor," Sangar said. "Have we been noticed?" said Akalor to Sangar. "Probably not," said Sangar. "This battle has come and gone. We tread its ashes." "Keep it that way," said Akalor. "How many days out from the target are we?" "At full speed, I can have you at extreme teleportation range in 3 days," she said.
"We should not rush in," said Vikalan.
"And yet we cannot afford to tarry," said Akalor. "Have the Radiance linger within the bounds of this debris field for a few hours. Let us be just another wreck. I want a full system scan and anything you can gather from the Vox. Ashmeln, see if you can contact the planetary astropaths. We need a clear picture of what is going on here. Once we have more intelligence, or by the second watch, make full speed for Gathalamor, whichever comes soonest." Sangar offered him another salute and ascended to the centre of the deck, where her orders rang out like bolt shells.
"Fleet Primus is likely but days behind us," commented Vikalan.
"Battle groups Praxis, Orpheus, and Styx at least," said Akalor.
"And Lord Gilliman and Tribune Colquan not far behind," added Vikalan.
The words were redundant, of course. Both custodians knew the stakes of this mission, yet the custom was an old one between Akalor and Vikalan. Reiterate the basic fact aloud, the better to process the plethora of details racing through their minds.
"If there is a threat here, as the Xenos witch predicted, the Crusade could be decapitated."
"Consider Scorathio," suggested Akalor, naming a military philosopher from the 37th millennium. Both of them had read his treatises and had meditated at length upon them.
"The foe who considers themselves victorious courts only their own defeat," quoted Vikalan.